So I know many of you receive Richard Rohr's daily reflections. He's a Catholic priest. This reflection comes actually from July of 2023, but he says this. One of the few subversive texts in history is the Bible. The Bible is most extraordinary because it repeatedly and invariably legitimizes the people on the bottom, not the people on the top. Rejected sons, barren women, sinners, lepers, or outsiders are always the ones chosen by God. It's rather obvious when pointed out to us. In every case, we are presented with some form of powerlessness, and from that situation, God creates a new kind of power. This is the constant pattern found hidden in plain sight. In case after case, the victim becomes the real victor. Leading philosopher René Girard spoke of the privileged position of the most victimized victim as the absolutely unique and revolutionary perspective of the Gospels. Without this bias from the bottom, religion ends up defending propriety instead of human pain, the status quo instead of the suffering masses, triumphalism instead of truth, clerical privilege instead of charity and compassion.
The apostles came back to Jesus and reported all that they had done and taught. Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to some place more remote and rest a while." For there were many people coming and going, and the apostles hadn't had time to eat. So they went away in a boat to a deserted area. The people saw them leaving, and many recognized them. So they ran together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of the apostles. When Jesus went ashore, there was a large crowd waiting for him, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. By now it was getting very late, and his disciples came up to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and it's very late. Why not dismiss them so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat?" Jesus replied, "Give them something to eat yourselves." They answered, "You want us to spend half a year's wages on bread for them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go look." When they found out, they reported back, 5 and 2 fish. Jesus told them to have the people sit down on the grass in groups of hundreds and fifties. Then Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, raised his eyes to heaven, and said the blessing. Jesus broke the loaves and handed them to the disciples to distribute amongst the people. He also passed out the 2 fish among them. They all ate until they had had their fill. The disciples gathered up the leftovers and filled 12 baskets of broken bread and fish. In all, 5,000 families ate that day.
Would you pray with me? Holy One, as we gather, may we focus our minds and our hearts beyond ourselves and our troubles, to see deeper and wider, further, to trust in a presence that we cannot see, and an energy that shimmers of love. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So, yesterday Julie was listening to a few things on her phone, and she happened to come across this preacher who was very, very adamantly talking to his congregation about how voting is not a spiritual obligation, but is a civic privilege. And he went on to say, don't talk to me about voting and don't talk to me about politics, because Jesus wasn't political. And I beg to differ. It seems to me, and in the words of Richard Rohr, that the Bible is one of the most subversive, rebellious texts out there. And Jesus clearly, in the midst of that text, calls for us to care for the least of these. Right? You remember that text? I didn't use that for today, but it was an option to care for those who are imprisoned, to treat them well, the prisoner and the hungry and those who need clothes and those who need shelter, and on, to care for the least of these. And if caring for the least of these is our spiritual obligation, and if the way that we care for the least of these is to stand up and to speak out against policies and programs or initiatives or words that are against the least of these, if voting means that that's how we care for the least of these, then all of that too is a spiritual obligation. These are unusual times and difficult times. And they call for us to think a little bit differently. And to rethink maybe sometimes how we do what we do here on Sunday mornings. I had somebody ask me, I was at the protest in Monument Square last Monday, and I had actually a friend say to me, so how does this work for you as a pastor? And I said, this is way beyond politics. I said, this is about morals and ethics and spirituality and theology and standing up for the least of these. So let's talk a little bit about Jesus' defiance when it comes to dehumanizing others. That was the title for today, the defiance of dehumanization, right? So let me start here. Let me ask you, what does it look like when we dehumanize somebody else? How do we treat them? What do we do?
Disregard.
We disregard them.
Talk down to them.
We talk down to them.
Exclude.
Exclude.
Call them names.
Call them names.
Hurt them.
Hurt them.
Gather them in a group and ship them to another country.
Gather them in a group and imprison them or ship them somewhere else or beat them or whatever it could be, yeah. Stereotyping.
Privatize.
Privatizing. I think wanting to assert control over. Violence. Not caring. Not respecting. Not standing up for. Robin.
Just plain hurting them.
Just plain hurting. Dehumanizes someone.
Ignoring them.
Ignoring them.
Saying their problems are all their fault.
Saying their problems are all their fault. Carol?
Indifference.
Indifference. Not inviting them to the table. Not giving them the same amount of M&Ms.
Trivializing their struggles.
Trivializing their struggles. there's a lot of ways to dehumanize people, aren't there? So the next question is, why? Why do we dehumanize others? Fear of?
Difference.
Fear of difference.
Insecurity.
Insecurity.
Make ourselves feel better.
Make ourselves feel better.
Power.
Power.
Control.
Control.
Stereotyping. You look at the person and you stereotype them, so you have decided that this is what it is.
Right. So,
It's judgment.
so we are judging, yes. And we're judging them to be less than, correct? And so therefore we justify whatever it is we want to control for them, whatever it is we want to do for them, because they're less than anyways. Sadly, it sounds very familiar these days. And then we add to that another layer of rhetoric and way of dealing with it. So I don't know how many of you heard Elon Musk's comment that the foundational weakness of Western civilization is empathy.
Whoa.
Yeah. The foundational weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Because if you have empathy, it makes it a lot harder to dehumanize, which makes it a lot harder to have control over and justify what you're doing. The other thing I heard was that Jim Wallace reported it and quoted the source, which was a newspaper that wouldn't let me in without subscribing, but basically said that in a private State Department meeting, the evangelical Christian pastors present were told not to talk about the consequences of defunding U.S. aid. So, no empathy and don't talk about the consequences. Because then we start to care if we have empathy. Heaven forbid we walk a mile in somebody else's shoes and think about what we are doing, how that might affect them. Heaven forbid we talk about the consequences of what it means to take millions of dollars away from U.S. aid, or deport thousands and thousands of undocumented immigrants, but maybe a few documented ones too. Yeah, over ridiculous things. Heaven forbid we talk about what it means to defund the Department of Education, or prohibit DEI programs, or defund our national parks. The list goes on and on. And we could be here all morning talking about the list.
I have an 18-year-old great nephew that I literally talked with yesterday.
Right.
He carries around his birth certificate for fear that he can be deported.
Right. And Julie has a great nephew who's half Honduran. And make sure he's got his documentation. But that's not even secure, is it? So, not trying to go down that rabbit hole. Trying to say that if we take away empathy and we take away talking about the consequences, it makes it a whole lot easier to dehumanize and to just let all kinds of injustices run rampant. So perhaps it sounds a little odd to be talking about the feeding of the 5,000 in this context, because it sounds sort of like a fluffy feel-good story, right? Oh look, they all sat down and they all shared a meal together, or you could look at it as miraculously these loaves and fish became enough food for 5,000 families, so let's at least multiply that by 2. So 10,000 people. But I think if we dig into this story just a little bit, we'll find out that it's a very subversive story. It's not to us today because we don't live in the context, but it was then. Because who were part of the 10,000 people? Jesus and his disciples were pretty much good, upstanding Jewish folk. Do you think all those 10,000 folks were good, upstanding, law-abiding, kosher-eating Jewish folk? No, who were they? What kinds of people were there?
Gentiles?
Anyone and everyone, including
Gentiles?
Gentiles? What was it?
Women?
Women and children. Cripples? People with illness? People with physical issues? What was that? The downtrodden, the poor, the dirty, the hungry, the criminals, the eunuchs, the prostitutes, there were probably some folk like you and me, some curious folks. There were probably some Jews, probably some folks who didn't like him a whole lot, were spying on him. It was everybody. Everybody was there. So for a good Jewish guy and his disciples, they normally wouldn't talk with most of those folks, much less eat with most of those folks, or touch most of those folks, because in their religious tradition, it would make them unclean. And then they would have to go through a process of becoming clean again. But when they did that, it ruined their reputation. It had the other good-standing Jewish folks going, oh, look at them. They're not eating with the right people or talking to the right people. Or it was an issue. And so when Jesus says to have them sit in groups of hundreds or 50s, he's not dividing them up. Okay, all you poor, dirty people over here, and all you good, upstanding Jewish folks over here, y'all just sit down, right? Let's have a meal. Jesus is saying, welcome to the resistance. Y'all sit down and eat with one another, and have a conversation with one another, and understand that we're all in this together. And this is what the kingdom of God looks like. When everyone is equal, when everyone shares, when we don't dehumanize anyone and keep them excluded, when we care about all people, when we eat together and talk to each other. That was radical. You follow that? That was a subversive story to tell over and over and over again. We don't dehumanize others. We sit down and we eat with them. We share our food with them. How many of you have heard of the author Valerie Kaur? K-A-U-R. She's a woman in the Sikh tradition, S-I-K-H. Sikh. Some people say Sikh. I know it sounds funny to say Sikh, but I've been told that's the correct saying. Anyways, however you want to say it. She wrote a book sharing their wisdom stories and then following it up with her own reflections and her own stories of traveling to those places in India where those stories took place. And she tells a story that took place hundreds of years ago about Guru Angad and his wife Madhakivi. So they're in Kandur, India, and they're trying to form a new spiritual community that includes all people. You know the caste system is big in India, and hundreds of years ago it was even more entrenched, right? So they wanted to get past the caste system, to welcome all people, to welcome the poor and women and people of different religions even. So they were trying to form this kind of community, and people were coming from all over to hear the ancestral wisdom and to bring their kids and play some games, and there were wrestling matches for young people and so forth. And Madhakivi always served them a meal. Well, one day, a man showed up in very crisp white clothes, and he wanted to join the community. And Madhakivi welcomed him, and she bid him to sit down and eat, and she directed him to a spot that was right next to a poor couple who were very dark-skinned, who had tattered clothes, whose hands were rough and calloused from their work as shoemakers. And the man just bristled. And he didn't know what to do. That caste system was so deeply entrenched with him that he wanted nothing to do with anyone of low caste. And yet, he equally wanted to be a part of the simplicity and the compassion of that community. And so he stood there with this internal conflict until he finally couldn't do it and he walked away. Well, Matakibi couldn't sleep that night, and she tossed and turned, trying to figure out how they could create a community that lived an alternative way of being in the world. And she thought, what if we could get everybody every day to come together and sit down and eat together? And what if the food were so good that the caste system didn't matter? That it just felt good to be sitting there eating together. So the community built a Langar hall, which is like a big outdoor kitchen with a well. And when it was done, she got up early and she cooked the most delicious meal she could make. And then she blew the conch shell, and everybody from the surrounding area came in to see what was going on. And as they came, she directed them to sit down in 2 long rows facing each other, sitting next to each other, shoulders pretty much touching. And there was one father who took his family and went away, and there were a few others who politely declined. But many people stayed to eat, and she served them this delicious meal, and they all sat there and they ate it without looking at each other and without talking. And then her daughter brought out a big bowl of steaming sweet kheer, steaming sweet rice pudding. And everybody got these big smiles on their faces, like when Jeff or Donna brings their cookies out, and we go, ah, yes. And they started to pass out these bowls of kheer, and somebody asked Matakibi to sit, and they helped serve. And then the next day, when she got to that big outdoor kitchen, there were a bunch of volunteers standing there, ready to help cook the next day's meal. And a number of people with big baskets full of grains and vegetables and fruits from the outlying farms who had come to contribute to the meal. And after the meal had been cooked and she blew the conch shell, people went, really? We get to do this again? And they all came in, and they found their guru, not seated up on a little high chair, but seated on the floor with a poor couple on one side and a high caste person on the other side and a Muslim woman across from him. And they all sat eating like a family. Hundreds of years later, that meal is still served in Kandur. A meal of fellowship, a meal of equality, a meal of welcome. And she wrote this. Throughout the world, the most effective caste systems and social hierarchies kept people apart when it came to the most intimate exchanges, living, eating, and loving, and enforced those rules with brutality. Langar was embodied protest, radical and subversive. Eating together with people of all castes and creeds meant rejecting with your body and breath adherence to hierarchy. Langar was more than a rebellion. It was a practice for an alternative world of solidarity, dignity, and humility. And that's what the feeding of the 5,000 was. It was an It was a practice of an alternative reality of equality and dignity and humility and solidarity. One more little something. Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop in San Salvador, was murdered while performing Mass 45 years ago tomorrow. And he was murdered because he stood up for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized. And when they had his service in the cathedral that he often preached in, the peasants, the local landless people and the field workers came from miles and miles around to pay tribute to him because they loved him. Because for the last 3 years, he had been like a father to them, protecting them from a death government. And not only were those people coming to pay their respects, and not only were they torn apart because they had loved the man and he loved them, but now they were terrified that nothing stood between them and the government. Oscar Romero had been belittled and called a communist and called unintelligent and a bad priest and an aggravator. He was put down over and over and over again by the powers that be, but he stood firm in understanding that it was his call to be doing what he was doing, to be working for Christ. And that this was not playing politics. This is doing what Jesus would have him do. And he said this in a sermon. He said, "People do not light a candle and put it under a basket," said Christ. "They light it and put it up high so that it gives light." That is a true community. A community is a group of women and men who have found the truth in Christ and in his gospel and joined together to follow the way of truth more resolutely. A community is a family that believes. It is a group where each member accepts God and feels strengthened by the others. In their moments of weakness, they help one another and love one another. They shed the light of their faith as an example for others. When that happens, the preachers no longer need to preach because there are Christians whose very lives have become a form of preaching. I said once before, and I repeat today, sisters and brothers, that if some sad day they silence our radio and stop us from writing in our newspaper, then all of you who believe must become microphones, radio stations, and loudspeakers. Not by talking, but by living the faith. I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But we come from a really strong tradition of standing up for the underdog and the oppressed and the marginalized and those who are being hurt and dehumanized. The biggest challenge of the Christian faith is that we stand up to dehumanization without succumbing to dehumanizing others ourselves. Do you follow that? We cannot stoop to dehumanizing others. It is for us to let our light shine, a light of justice and compassion and empathy. And yes, looking at the consequences of our actions and gathering with those unlike us to bridge differences. And so, as hard as life gets sometimes, let your light shine with love and compassion and mercy and grace. Amen.